They dumped him like trash, but when they reunited, the world cried. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. The autumn leaves danced around Charles Wilson's feet as he stood before the imposing brick building with Hope Animal Shelter emblazoned across its entrance. His weathered hands trembled, but not from the chill of the October air. The German shepherd at his side, Duke, wagged his tail enthusiastically, unaware that his world was about to change forever. "It's just temporary, boy," Charles whispered, his voice breaking. "Just until I get better." Duke looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand every word. The dog had been Charles's loyal companion for 5 years, ever since he was a rambunctious puppy who destroyed Charles's favorite armchair and somehow managed to make him laugh about it. Charles hadn't laughed much these days. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a grim mantra: progressive condition, limited mobility, assisted living, impossible to care for a large dog. Each diagnosis seemed to steal another piece of his independence, another fragment of the life he had built after losing Eleanor, his wife of 40 years. "Mr. Wilson." A young woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Jessica approached them. "We spoke on the phone yesterday." Charles nodded, unable to trust his voice. Duke pressed against his leg, sensing his distress. "I understand this is difficult," Jessica said softly, "but I promise we'll take good care of him until you're back on your feet." Until. The word hung between them like a fragile promise neither truly believed. "He likes to sleep with his blue blanket," Charles said, reaching into the canvas bag he'd brought, "and he needs to be walked twice daily, morning and evening. He prefers the morning walk longer. And Charles's voice caught, the lump in his throat growing. He doesn't like thunderstorms. Gets anxious. If you play some classical music, it helps him calm down." Jessica smiled gently. "We'll make sure to follow his routine as closely as possible. And you can visit whenever you'd like." Charles nodded again, though they both knew visits would be difficult with his declining health and the assisted living facility 40 minutes away. "Duke, sit," Charles commanded, and the shepherd obeyed instantly, looking up expectantly for his next instruction. Charles knelt down painfully, his joints protesting. He cupped Duke's face in his hands, memorizing every detail: the small white patch under his chin, the slight tear in his left ear from a long-ago fence encounter, the warmth of his breath. "You be a good boy," Charles whispered. "I'll come back for you. I promise." Duke licked his face, tail wagging, still believing the world was good and promises were never broken. The handover was a blur. Paperwork signed with shaking hands. Instructions given. The blue blanket and favorite toys transferred to Jessica's care. And then the moment Charles had dreaded, placing Duke's leash in Jessica's hand while instructing the dog to stay. "It's better this way," Charles told himself as he turned to leave. He deserves someone who can run with him, throw balls, take him hiking. The justifications felt hollow even as they formed in his mind. As the door closed behind him, Charles heard the first confused whine from Duke, followed by a bark that seemed to ask, "Where are you going? Why aren't I coming with you?" He forced himself not to look back, though each step away felt like walking through quicksand. The taxi waiting to take him to Pine Ridge Assisted Living Center seemed to represent everything he was losing. His home of 30 years sold to pay for medical expenses, his independence surrendered to nurses and schedules, and now Duke, his most faithful companion. Inside the shelter, Duke watched the door long after Charles had gone. Jessica tried to coax him toward the kennel area with treats and gentle words, but the shepherd refused to move from his spot, ears perked forward, waiting for the return of his person. "He'll settle in," one of the other staff members assured Jessica. "They always do eventually." But Duke wasn't like other dogs. As days turned into weeks, he maintained his vigil. He would eat only when food was placed directly in front of him. He would walk when led on a leash, but always circled back to the same spot near the entrance. The shelter staff tried everything: new toys, socialization with other dogs, extra attention, but Duke remained withdrawn, his spirit seemingly tethered to someone no longer there. Charles wasn't faring much better at Pine Ridge. His room was comfortable enough, a single bed, a small kitchenette he rarely used, a television he seldom watched. The staff was kind, the food adequate, but it wasn't home. There were no muddy paw prints on the floor, no enthusiastic greeting when he returned from physical therapy, no warm body curled at the foot of his bed. He tried to call the shelter daily, asking about Duke, whether he was eating, if anyone had shown interest in adopting him. The answers were always delivered with forced cheerfulness that couldn't quite mask the truth. Duke was struggling, just as Charles was. "You should focus on your recovery, Mr. Wilson," his physical therapist advised. "The stress isn't helping your condition." But how could he explain that Duke wasn't just a pet? After Eleanor's passing, when the house had grown too quiet and the days too long, Duke had given him purpose. Wake up, feed Duke. Walk Duke. Talk to Duke. Care for Duke. Simple routines that anchored him to the world when grief threatened to untether him completely. On particularly bad nights, when pain kept him awake and loneliness pressed in from all sides, Charles would reach for his phone and scroll through photos of Duke. Duke at the beach, ears flapping in the wind. Duke with a ridiculous birthday hat. Duke sprawled across Charles's lap, taking up far more space than should be physically possible for any creature. One morning, 3 weeks after the separation, Charles woke with a determination that had been absent since his diagnosis. He dressed carefully, ignoring the tremor in his hands as he buttoned his shirt. He packed a small bag with Duke's favorite treats and a new toy he'd ordered online. Then he approached the nurse's station with as much dignity as his cane would allow. "I need to arrange transportation to Hope Animal Shelter," he announced. The nurse looked up, surprised. "Mr. Wilson, you don't have any appointments scheduled today." "This isn't a medical appointment. I'm going to see my dog." Her expression softened with sympathy. "I understand, but Dr. Patel specifically recommended limiting outings until your medication regimen is stabilized. Perhaps in another week or two." "I've waited 3 weeks already," Charles interrupted, a steel entering his voice that hadn't been there in months. "I made a promise to my dog and I intend to keep it." The nurse hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and compassion. "Let me speak with the supervisor," she finally said. Charles returned to his room to wait, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and hope. The minutes stretched endlessly until a knock came at his door. "Mr. Wilson?" It was the facility director, Dr. Mercer. "I understand you're requesting transportation to visit your dog." Charles straightened in his chair. "Yes, I am. While I appreciate your attachment to your pet, I'm concerned about the physical strain. Your last blood pressure reading was—" "With all due respect," Charles cut in, "I'm well aware of my condition. I'm not asking to run a marathon. I'm asking to sit in a car, then sit in a room with my dog. If that's too much exertion, then perhaps you should inform my insurance company they're paying for a prison, not a care facility." Dr. Mercer's eyebrows rose, but Charles detected a glimmer of respect in his expression. "Very well. I'll have the staff arrange transportation for this afternoon. But I must insist that one of our aides accompany you." Charles wanted to argue, but recognized a compromise when he heard one. "Thank you," he said instead. As the car pulled away from Pine Ridge later that day, Charles felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced in years. Would Duke remember him? Would he be angry? Had someone else adopted him already? The aide, a young man named Miguel who had been assigned to accompany him, seemed to sense his anxiety. "My grandmother had to leave her cat behind when she moved into assisted living," he offered. The cat recognized her even after months apart. Charles nodded gratefully, clinging to this small reassurance as the familiar streets gave way to the neighborhood where Hope Animal Shelter stood. When they finally arrived, Charles's heart was racing. Miguel helped him from the car, steadying him when his legs threatened to buckle. From weakness or emotion, Charles couldn't tell. At the reception desk, Charles cleared his throat. "I'm here to see Duke, the German shepherd I brought in 3 weeks ago." The receptionist looked up, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, of course. Let me get Jessica for you." Jessica appeared moments later, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Mr. Wilson, we've been hoping you'd visit." She hesitated slightly. "Duke has been— well, he's been waiting for you." "Is he okay?" Charles asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "Physically, he's fine," Jessica assured him. "But emotionally, She gestured for Charles to follow her. "It's better if you see for yourself." Charles gripped his cane tightly as he made his way through the shelter, past kennels filled with barking dogs. The noise was deafening, but one particular absence struck him. Duke's deep, distinctive bark was nowhere to be heard. Jessica led him to a quiet area toward the back of the facility. "We moved him here after the first week," she explained. "He wasn't responding well to the main kennel environment." She stopped before a chain-link enclosure. Inside, Duke lay facing the wall, his body curled into itself, the blue blanket Charles had brought untouched beside him. The sight of his once vibrant companion so withdrawn sent a physical pain through Charles's chest. "Duke," he called softly. The German shepherd's ears twitched, then swiveled backward. Slowly, as if afraid to hope, Duke turned his head. The moment his amber eyes locked onto Charles, a transformation occurred. Duke leapt to his feet, body quivering with excitement, a high-pitched whine escaping his throat. Jessica quickly opened the gate, and Duke bounded toward Charles, nearly knocking the elderly man over in his enthusiasm. Charles dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain, as Duke covered his face with frantic licks, his entire body wiggling with joy. "I missed you too." "Boy," Charles choked out, burying his face in Duke's fur. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Time seemed to suspend as man and dog reconnected, each drawing strength from the other's presence. When Charles finally looked up, his face wet with tears and dog saliva, he found Jessica watching them with glistening eyes. "He's been like this since you left," she said quietly. "Waiting by the door at first, then gradually withdrawing when you didn't return. He barely eats, hardly sleeps. We've had interest from several potential adopters, but he shows no response to anyone. It's like he isn't waiting." Charles stroked Duke's head, the familiar texture of his fur like a balm to his soul. "I never wanted to leave him," he said, voice rough with emotion. "The doctors said I couldn't care for him anymore. The assisted living facility doesn't allow pets." Each word felt like an inadequate excuse now, with Duke pressed against him as if afraid Charles might disappear again. "Would you like some time alone with him?" Jessica offered. "We have a private visiting room." Charles nodded gratefully. With Miguel's help, he rose to his feet and Duke stayed pressed against his leg, unwilling to allow even an inch of separation. The visiting room was simple: a couch, a few chairs, a water bowl, and some toys. Charles lowered himself onto the couch, and Duke immediately jumped up beside him, resting his head on Charles's lap with a contented sigh. "I brought you something," Charles said, reaching for the bag Miguel had carried in. He pulled out a plush toy shaped like a raccoon, identical to Duke's favorite toy that had been loved to destruction years ago. Duke sniffed it curiously, then gently took it in his mouth, his tail offering a tentative wag. For the first time since their reunion, Charles smiled. "You remember, don't you?" Miguel slipped out quietly, leaving man and dog to their reunion. Charles talked to Duke for hours, telling him about Pine Ridge, about his physical therapy, about how empty his room felt without a German shepherd taking up most of the bed. Duke listened with the attentive expression that had always made Charles feel like the most important person in the world. When Jessica returned, the reluctance on her face was evident before she spoke. "Mr. Wilson, I hate to interrupt, but the shelter will be closing soon." Reality crashed back upon Charles. This visit wasn't a solution. It was merely a brief respite from their separation. The thought of walking out that door, of leaving Duke behind again, was unbearable. Would it be possible for me to visit again tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course," Jessica said quickly. "You're welcome any time during visiting hours." Duke would love that. But as Charles prepared to leave, Duke's behavior changed. He became agitated, moving between Charles and the door, blocking the exit. When Charles tried to stand, Duke pressed against his legs, as if trying to herd him back to the couch. "He knows you're leaving," Jessica observed softly. Charles knelt again, wincing at the pain in his knees. "I have to go now, boy," he whispered. "But I promise I'll come back tomorrow. I'll come back tomorrow." Duke's eyes seemed to hold a desperate question. "Why not take me with you?" It was a question Charles had no good answer for. The parting was excruciating. Jessica had to gently hold Duke back as Charles left, the dog's plaintive whines following him out to the parking lot. In the car, Charles was silent, his mind racing with thoughts and possibilities. each seeming more impossible than the last. Miguel, sensing his turmoil, offered quiet support. "He really loves you," the aide said as they approached Pine Ridge. "I've never seen anything like it." Charles nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. As they pulled into the facility parking lot, he made a decision. "Miguel," he said, turning to the young man, "I need your help." Back at Pine Ridge, Charles bypassed his room and went straight to Dr. Mercer's office. The facility director looked surprised at the unscheduled visit, but invited him in. "How was your reunion with your dog?" Dr. Mercer asked. "It confirmed what I already knew," Charles replied, sitting straight-backed in the chair. "I need to bring Duke home." Dr. Mercer's expression softened with sympathy. "Mr. Wilson, I understand your attachment, but Pine Ridge's policy on pets is very clear. The insurance regulations, the liability concerns. I'm not asking you to change your policies for everyone," Charles interrupted. "I'm asking you to make an exception. One exception. Even if I wanted to, which I do, there are regulations." "There are always regulations," Charles said, a lifetime of determination surfacing in his voice. "And there are always exceptions. Service animals, emotional support animals. Duke may not have certification, but he's been my reason for getting up every morning for the past 5 years." Dr. Mercer sighed. "It's not that simple. Service animals require specific training, documentation." "Then tell me what I need to do," Charles insisted. "What forms to fill out, what certifications to get. I'll do whatever it takes." The resolve in the elderly man's voice gave Dr. Mercer pause. He studied Charles for a long moment before responding. "Let me make some inquiries. No promises, Mr. Wilson, but I'll see what can be done." It wasn't the victory Charles had hoped for, but it was a beginning. As he returned to his room that evening, he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't experienced since his diagnosis. Meanwhile, at Hope Animal Shelter, Duke had retreated to his corner, but something had changed. The German Shepherd carried his new raccoon toy with him, placing it carefully on Charles's blue blanket, before curling around both treasures. Jessica noticed that for the first time in weeks, Duke ate his entire dinner. The next morning, Charles woke early, determined to return to the shelter as soon as visiting hours began. He was halfway dressed when a knock came at his door. "Mr. Wilson?" It was Miguel. "Dr. Mercer would like to see you in his office when you're ready." Charles's stomach tightened with anxiety. Had the director already decided against his request? Was this a polite rejection before Charles could even begin the fight? When he entered Dr. Mercer's office 20 minutes later, he was surprised to find Jessica from the shelter seated beside the director's desk. "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Mercer began, "after our conversation yesterday, I took the liberty of contacting Ms. Rodriguez here to discuss your situation." Charles looked between them, confusion and hope warring in his chest. "We believe we may have found a solution," Dr. Mercer continued, "though it will require some adaptation on your part and cooperation from Duke." "Anything," Charles said immediately. "Whatever it takes." Jessica leaned forward, her expression earnest. "There's a program we sometimes work with called Healing Paws. They train shelter dogs to become therapy animals for senior living communities. Usually the dogs live at the facilities and interact with all residents. But in special cases, Dr. Mercer picked up, a dog with an existing bond to a resident can be trained specifically to support that individual while still providing therapeutic benefits to others in the community." Charles's breath caught. "You mean Duke could live here with me?" "Potentially," Dr. Mercer cautioned, "if he passes the temperament evaluation and completes the necessary training. There would be conditions. He would need to spend time with other residents, maintain certain behavioral standards. You would need assistance with his care on days when your health doesn't permit it. And the training isn't easy," Jessica added. "It would require commitment from both of you. But Duke is intelligent, and his bond with you is extraordinary. I believe he has the potential." Charles felt light-headed with possibility. "When could we start?" "That's the thing," Jessica said, a smile breaking across her face. "I brought the program coordinator with me today. She's waiting to meet Duke. If you're feeling up to it, we could go back to the shelter right now for an initial assessment." Charles looked down at his trembling hands, then back up at the two people offering him this unexpected chance. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. As Miguel helped him to the waiting car, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging for him, for Duke, for everyone involved in this unconventional arrangement. But for the first time since his diagnosis, Charles allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than just loss and limitation. A future where Duke's paws would again pad alongside him, where evenings would be spent with a warm presence by his side, where morning walks would give structure to his days. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life worth fighting for. And as the car pulled away from Pine Ridge, Charles made a silent promise, not just to Duke this time, but to himself. This time he wouldn't give up. This time they would find a way forward together. The car pulled into the shelter parking lot, and Charles felt his heart racing with anticipation. This time the visit carried more weight than a simple reunion. It held the possibility of a future together. Inside, they were greeted by a woman in her 40s, with salt and pepper hair pulled into a practical ponytail. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Diane Harper, coordinator for the Healing Paws program." She extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. "Jessica has told me quite a bit about you and Duke." "All good things, I hope," Charles replied, trying to mask his nervousness. Diane smiled. "She mentioned an exceptional bond between a man and his dog. That's always a good starting point for what we do." She gestured toward the hallway. "Shall we go see him?" This time, when they approached Duke's enclosure, the German Shepherd was alert and waiting, the raccoon toy still carefully positioned on Charles's blue blanket. At the sight of Charles, Duke's entire demeanor transformed, tail wagging, eyes bright, body vibrating with joy. Jessica opened the gate, and Duke rushed to Charles, circling him excitedly before sitting at his feet, looking up with adoration. "Well," Diane said, watching the interaction with professional interest, "there's certainly no question about the bond." She knelt down, allowing Duke to sniff her hand. "May I?" she asked Charles, who nodded permission. Diane ran her hands along Duke's back, checked his ears, and gently examined his paws. Duke tolerated the examination with dignified patience, though his eyes kept darting back to Charles, as if to say, "Is this really necessary?" "He's in excellent physical condition," Diane commented, rising to her feet. "Now let's see about his temperament and basic training." What followed was a series of exercises, basic commands, reaction to loud noises, behavior around food, response to strangers. Charles watched anxiously as Duke performed each test, his heart swelling with pride at his companion's intelligence and composure. "He's remarkably well trained," Diane noted, jotting observations in her notebook. "Did you do formal obedience work with him?" Charles shook his head. "Just consistency and patience. We learned together." Diane smiled. "That's often the best approach." She closed her notebook. "Based on what I've seen, Duke is definitely a candidate for our program. He has the right temperament, good basic training, and most importantly, a strong motivation, his connection to you." Hope bloomed in Charles's chest. "So he can come to Pine Ridge?" "Not immediately," Diane cautioned. "There's specialized training he'll need, learning to navigate a facility environment, how to behave around medical equipment, proper interactions with other residents who might be frail or unsteady. We typically require a minimum of 6 weeks of training." 6 weeks. Charles's heart sank. "That's a long time to be separated." Diane's expression softened. "I understand, which is why I'd like to propose something a bit unconventional. Normally, we train the dogs at our facility, but in Duke's case, I think it would be beneficial for you to be involved in the process." "How would that work?" Charles asked, unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. "You'd need to commit to coming to the shelter 3 times a week for training sessions. It would be physically demanding for you," Diane warned, "but your presence would be invaluable to Duke's progress." Before Charles could respond, Dr. Mercer stepped forward. "Pine Ridge could arrange transportation as part of Mr. Wilson's therapy program. Physical activity with a purpose often yields better results than standard exercises." Charles looked from Dr. Mercer to Diane, overwhelmed by their willingness to accommodate his situation. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Just tell me when we start." The training began the following Monday. Charles arrived at the shelter to find Duke waiting eagerly, already wearing a special vest that identified him as a therapy dog in training. The first session focused on basic commands in a distracting environment. Duke needed to learn to stay focused on his handler, despite the chaos that could occur in a medical setting. Heel, Charles commanded, walking slowly with his cane through an obstacle course Diane had set up. Duke matched his pace perfectly, attentive and responsive. Excellent, Diane praised. Now let's try with some distractions. Jessica and another staff member began bouncing balls, clanging metal bowls, and making sudden movements nearby. Duke's ears perked with interest, but he remained steadfastly at Charles's side. He's a natural, Diane said, clearly impressed. Most dogs take weeks to achieve this level of focus. Charles beamed with pride. He's always been special. The sessions continued 3 times weekly, each more challenging than the last. Duke learned to remain calm around wheelchairs and walkers, to gently greet people who moved unpredictably, to navigate the sounds and smells of a medical environment without becoming anxious. For Charles, the training provided something equally valuable, a renewed sense of purpose. His physical therapist at Pine Ridge noted improvements in his strength and mobility, attributing the progress to his determination to keep up with Duke's training. "You're pushing yourself harder for him than you ever did for me," she teased during a particularly grueling session. Charles smiled. He's a better motivator. 4 weeks into the program, Diane suggested the next phase, a trial visit to Pine Ridge. "Duke's progress has been exceptional," she explained. "I think he's ready for a supervised introduction to the actual environment." The day of the visit arrived, with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Charles waited in the community room at Pine Ridge, nervously adjusting his sweater as residents gathered, curious about the therapy dog they'd heard so much about. When Duke entered, proudly wearing his official therapy vest, a murmur of appreciation rippled through the room. The German Shepherd walked confidently beside Diane, alert but composed. When he spotted Charles, his ears perked up, but he maintained his disciplined pace until Diane gave the release command. "Go say hello." Duke trotted directly to Charles, pressing against his leg in greeting, before sitting attentively at his side, ready for the next instruction. "This is Duke," Charles announced to the gathered residents, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "He's training to become a permanent resident here." What followed was a carefully orchestrated introduction to Pine Ridge. Duke moved through the facility with remarkable poise, greeting residents with gentle nudges, allowing arthritic hands to stroke his fur, demonstrating perfect manners in the dining area. Mrs. Jenkins, a usually withdrawn resident who rarely left her room, actually smiled when Duke approached her wheelchair, placing his head gently on her lap. "He seems to know who needs him most," the activities director remarked, watching the interaction. By the end of the visit, even the most skeptical staff members were won over. Duke had performed flawlessly, demonstrating not just obedience but a natural empathy that couldn't be trained. In Dr. Mercer's office afterward, the assessment was unanimously positive. "I've never seen residents respond so quickly to a therapy animal," the activities director reported. "His behavior was impeccable," added the head nurse. "No jumping, no barking, not even when Mr. Porter dropped his tray." Dr. Mercer turned to Charles. "It seems your Duke is something special, Mr. Wilson. If Diane agrees his training is on track, I think we can start discussing the logistics of making him a permanent resident." Charles could hardly believe what he was hearing. After weeks of training, countless hours of work, and the longest separation he'd ever endured from Duke, they were finally approaching the possibility of reunion. "There's still work to do," Diane cautioned. "Today was a supervised visit in a controlled environment. We need to ensure Duke can maintain this behavior consistently, especially when he's just with you." "What do you mean?" Charles asked. "Duke needs to understand that even though he's living with you, he's still working when he's in the common areas. He can't revert to being just a pet outside your room," Diane explained. "It's a difficult transition for most dogs, and their owners." Charles nodded solemnly. "We'll make it work." The final 2 weeks of training focused on this crucial distinction, teaching Duke to recognize when he was on duty versus when he could relax and be a companion. The vest became his signal. When wearing it, he was a working therapy dog with responsibilities to all residents. When the vest came off in Charles's room, he could be just Duke. "You're doing amazingly well," Diane told Charles during their final training session. "Both of you are. Charles smiled, watching Duke demonstrate a gentle retrieval exercise designed to help residents with limited mobility. He's the one doing all the work. Don't sell yourself short, Diane countered. This wouldn't have been possible without your commitment. Most people wouldn't have persevered through 6 weeks of intensive training at your age and with your health challenges. Charles thought about the past weeks, the physical exhaustion after training sessions, the emotional roller coaster of seeing Duke only to leave him again, the rigorous exercises he'd forced himself to do at Pine Ridge to maintain the strength needed for handling a large dog. When something matters enough, he said simply, you find the strength. The day before Duke's scheduled move to Pine Ridge, Charles visited the shelter one last time. Jessica had prepared all of Duke's belongings, his blanket, toys, food bowls, and medical records. Diane had completed the final paperwork, designating Duke as an official therapy dog, with primary attachment to Charles Wilson, but available to provide support to other residents. Are you ready for tomorrow? Jessica asked, helping Charles gather Duke's things. More than ready, Charles replied. It's been the longest 6 weeks of my life. Jessica smiled. Duke feels the same way. He's been so much more animated since the training started. Having a purpose again, and knowing he'd see you regularly, it brought him back to life. Charles knelt to Duke's level, scratching behind his ears. One more night, boy. Just one more night and then you're coming home. Duke licked his face as if in understanding. As Charles prepared to leave, Jessica handed him an envelope. What's this? He asked. Just some photos I took during the training. I thought you might like to have them. Back at Pine Ridge, Charles spread the photos across his bed. There was Duke learning to navigate around a wheelchair. Duke gently greeting a volunteer pretending to be frail. Duke looking up at Charles with unwavering trust during a particularly challenging exercise. The last photo caught Charles by surprise. It was of him, not Duke. In the image, Charles stood straighter than he had in years, his face alight with purpose and pride as he guided Duke through a complex command sequence. He barely recognized himself. The defeated man who had reluctantly surrendered his dog months ago was nowhere to be seen. That night, Charles placed the photos on his nightstand and lay awake, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Not the life they'd had before, but perhaps something equally meaningful. Outside his window, the moon cast silver light across the grounds of Pine Ridge. Somewhere across town, Charles knew Duke was also waiting for morning to come, for the moment when separation would end and adaptation would begin. Just one more night, Charles whispered to the darkness, echoing his promise to Duke. And then we start again. Dawn broke over Pine Ridge with golden promise. Charles had been awake for hours, methodically preparing his room for Duke's arrival. The small space had been transformed. A plush dog bed in the corner, though Charles suspected it would rarely be used. Water and food bowls arranged neatly by the kitchenette, a basket of toys tucked beside the television stand, and a hook by the door for Duke's therapy vest and leash. Dr. Mercer had arranged for Charles to have a ground-floor room with direct access to a small courtyard, a rare accommodation that spoke volumes about the administration's commitment to making this arrangement work. The adjacent courtyard had been designated as Duke's relief area, with waste bags and a disposal bin discreetly installed. At precisely 10 o'clock, a soft knock came at Charles's door. He opened it to find Diane, Jessica, and Duke waiting in the hallway. The German Shepherd was impeccably groomed, his therapy vest gleaming with official patches, his leash held loosely in Diane's hand. Special delivery, Jessica said with a bright smile. Charles knelt carefully, ignoring the protest from his joints. Welcome home, boy. Duke looked to Diane, who nodded and gave the release command. With gentle restraint that spoke to his excellent training, Duke approached Charles and nuzzled his hand before looking around curiously at his new surroundings. He's wondering if this is another training exercise or the real thing, Diane explained, handing Charles the leash. Why don't you show him around? Charles led Duke through the small apartment, showing him each carefully prepared space. This is where you'll eat, he explained, pointing to the bowls. And here's your bed, though I suspect you'll end up sharing mine like you always did. Duke followed attentively, sniffing each area, his ears perked with interest. When they reached the sliding glass door leading to the courtyard, Charles opened it. And this is your yard. Not as big as our old one, but it's all yours. Duke stepped outside, inspecting the space with methodical curiosity before returning to Charles's side, pressing against his leg in a gesture of contentment. "I think he approves," Jessica observed. The next hour was spent reviewing care protocols and schedules. Duke would spend mornings with Charles, afternoons as a therapy dog in the common areas, and evenings again with Charles. Staff would assist with walks on days when Charles's mobility was compromised. A local veterinarian had agreed to make house calls to Pine Ridge for Duke's regular checkups. "It's a lot to remember," Diane acknowledged, handing Charles a binder of information. "But you've both worked so hard for this. I have complete confidence in you." After they left, Charles sat on the edge of his bed, watching as Duke continued to explore his new home, occasionally returning to check on Charles, as if to make sure he was still there. "It's just us now," Charles told him softly. "We'll figure it out together." The first few days were a period of adjustment. Duke learned the rhythms of Pine Ridge, when the hallways were busiest, which residents welcomed his visits and which preferred distance, how to navigate around cleaning carts and meal deliveries. Charles adapted too, finding a new routine that balanced his own needs with Duke's care. The most remarkable transformation, however, was in Pine Ridge itself. The facility had always been clean, efficient, and professionally run, but with Duke's arrival, something fundamental shifted. Residents who had rarely left their rooms began appearing in common areas, hoping to interact with the German Shepherd. Conversation flowed more easily, laughter echoed more frequently. Mrs. Jenkins, who had connected with Duke during his trial visit, became a regular visitor to Charles's room. "I had a shepherd mix when I was younger," she confided, her gnarled hands gently stroking Duke's fur. "Best dog I ever had." Mr. Porter, known for his gruff demeanor, was spotted sneaking treats to Duke despite strict instructions about the dog's diet. When confronted by the head nurse, he simply shrugged. "Dog needs to live a little." "We all do." 2 weeks after Duke's arrival, Dr. Mercer requested a meeting with Charles. Anxiety knotted his stomach as he made his way to the director's office, Duke walking perfectly at heel beside him. Had there been complaints? Was the arrangement not working out? "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Mercer greeted him, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit. Duke can stay, of course." Charles lowered himself into the chair, Duke settling at his feet. "Is something wrong?" To his surprise, Dr. Mercer smiled. "Quite the opposite. I wanted to share some observations with you." He opened a folder on his desk. "Since Duke's arrival, we've documented a 43% increase in participation in group activities. Medication requests for anxiety and depression have decreased by nearly 20%. Staff reports indicate improved morale among both residents and employees." Charles blinked, processing the information. "That's remarkable, indeed. But perhaps most significant is your own progress." Dr. Mercer turned a page in the folder. "Your physical therapist reports substantial improvements in mobility and stamina. Your recent blood work shows improved markers across the board. And subjectively, staff have noted that you appear more engaged and positive." "Duke deserves the credit," Charles said, reaching down to stroke the shepherd's head. "Perhaps partially," Dr. Mercer acknowledged. "But I think it's more accurate to say you've both benefited from this reunion. Which brings me to my proposal." Charles tensed. "Proposal?" "Several other facilities in our network have expressed interest in implementing similar programs. And Diane has suggested that you and Duke might be willing to help advise them, share your experience, perhaps even visit occasionally to demonstrate what's possible." Charles stared at him in disbelief. "You want us to be consultants?" Dr. Mercer chuckled. "In a manner of speaking, nothing too demanding. Perhaps a monthly meeting, an occasional presentation. All transportation and accommodations would be arranged, of course, and always with your health as the priority." The idea was so unexpected that Charles found himself speechless. After a lifetime of defining himself through his career, then his role as Eleanor's husband, then his identity as Duke's owner, and finally as a patient, here was yet another reinvention. Mentor, advisor, pioneer. "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Dr. Mercer replied. "Discuss it with Duke. He seems to have excellent judgment." The joke, so unexpected from the usually formal director, startled a laugh from Charles. "That he does." That evening, Charles took Duke for their regular walk around the Pine Ridge grounds, considering Dr. Mercer's proposal. The path took them past the recreation room, where a small group of residents were playing cards. "Charles, Duke!" Mrs. Jenkins called from her wheelchair. "Come join us!" A year ago, even 6 months ago, Charles would have politely declined, retreating to the solitude that had become his comfort zone after Eleanor's passing. But now, with Duke at his side, he found himself changing course, heading toward the lively group. "Deal me in," he said, pulling up a chair. Duke settled beside him, instantly becoming the center of attention as residents paused their game to greet him. As cards were shuffled and jokes exchanged, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The painful separation that had seemed like an ending had instead become a beginning, not just for him and Duke, but for an entire community. 2 months later, Charles and Duke made their first official visit to Oakwood Terrace, a sister facility across town that was implementing its own therapy dog program. Duke, now comfortable in his dual role as Charles's companion and working therapy dog, demonstrated his skills with professional confidence. "The key is partnership," Charles explained to the assembled staff and administrators. "Duke isn't just a therapy dog who happens to live with me. We're a team. His success is my responsibility, and in many ways my well-being is his mission." After the presentation, a woman approached them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My father is moving into assisted living next month," she said. "He's heartbroken about leaving his retriever behind. I didn't think there were any other options until today." Charles exchanged a glance with Duke, who sat attentively at his side. "It won't be easy," he told her honestly. "The training is demanding, the certification process rigorous, but if the bond is strong enough, it's worth every effort." As winter melted into spring, Charles and Duke settled into their new life, with a contentment neither had thought possible during those dark days of separation. Their room at Pine Ridge had become a gathering place for residents seeking companionship, staff members needing a moment of canine therapy after difficult shifts, and occasionally families considering similar arrangements for their own loved ones. On a particularly beautiful April morning, Charles sat in the courtyard, watching Duke explore the emerging spring growth with the same enthusiasm he'd shown as a puppy. The shepherd's muzzle had begun to show touches of grey, a reminder that time moved forward for both of them. Mrs. Jenkins wheeled herself into the courtyard, a tablet computer balanced on her lap. "I've been reading about that new program you helped start at Meadowbrook," she said, positioning herself beside Charles's bench. "3 therapy dogs already. You're starting a revolution, Charles Wilson." Charles smiled, watching Duke investigate a butterfly with studied concentration. "Not me, we're just fortunate that Dr. Mercer was willing to take a chance." "Nonsense," Mrs. Jenkins scoffed. "It took courage to fight for what you needed, instead of accepting what you were offered. Most people would have given up." Charles considered her words. There had indeed been moments when giving up had seemed the only option, when his health was declining, when the shelter seemed an insurmountable distance away, when the training pushed his aging body to its limits. What had kept him going wasn't heroism or exceptional courage, but something far simpler. "When you love someone," he said finally, "you find strength you never knew you had." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, reaching down to stroke Duke as he trotted over to greet her. "That's what I keep telling my daughter. Love isn't just feeling, it's action. Sometimes difficult, exhausting action." As if understanding the weight of the conversation, Duke pressed his head against Charles's knee in a gesture of solidarity. Charles scratched behind his ears, marveling at how this one connection, this bond between man and dog, had not only survived against the odds, but had flourished and expanded, touching countless other lives in the process. Later that night, as Charles prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about Eleanor. She had always loved Duke, had encouraged Charles to adopt the energetic shepherd puppy despite their advancing age. "He'll keep you young," she had insisted. "And when I'm gone, he'll keep you going." How right she had been. Without Duke, Charles might have surrendered to his diagnosis, accepting limitation and isolation as inevitable companions of aging. Instead, he had discovered new purpose, new connections, and most importantly, new hope. Duke jumped onto the bed, an accommodation Pine Ridge had reluctantly approved after Charles pointed out that the arrangement predated any facility rules. The shepherd circled 3 times before settling against Charles's side, his warm weight familiar and comforting. "We did it, boy," Charles murmured, stroking the dog's sleek head. "We found our way back to each other." Duke sighed contentedly, resting his muzzle on Charles's chest. In the quiet of their shared room, with moonlight spilling across the bed, Charles felt a profound gratitude for this second chance, not just at companionship, but at living with purpose and meaning. Outside their window, Pine Ridge settled into nighttime stillness. In rooms throughout the facility, residents who had once felt isolated now carried the memory of Duke's visits into their dreams. Staff members who had witnessed the transformation now advocated for similar programs in other locations. And somewhere across town, a German Shepherd puppy was being evaluated for potential training as the next therapy dog to join Pine Ridge's growing program. All because one man had refused to accept that love and loyalty could be surrendered to circumstance. All because one dog had waited, faithful beyond reason or expectation. Their story of separation, perseverance, and ultimately reunion had rippled outward, creating possibilities where none had existed before. As sleep approached, Charles rested his hand on Duke's warm flank, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to share their journey. But for now, in this moment of perfect contentment, Charles knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, against all odds beginning again. Dear listeners, we hope that Charles and Duke's extraordinary journey of loyalty and perseverance has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that true bonds can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes our greatest challenges lead to unexpected new beginnings. If you found yourself moved by their remarkable reunion, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day, we bring you powerful stories that celebrate the depth of human-animal connections and the resilience of the human spirit. For more heartwarming tales of loyalty and second chances, check out our special playlist by clicking the link on the left. Your comments mean the world to us. We'd love to hear about the special animal companions who've changed your own lives. Until our next story, remember that love in its purest form always finds a way home.